In June 2008, there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It was negotiated by Egypt. And each side had obligations under the ceasefire. Hamas had to stop its rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. And Israel had to end its blockade of Gaza. Israel itself said at the time, Israel said that Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel would not lift the blockade of Gaza. So Hamas was doing what was expected of it from the ceasefire. But Israel refused to lift that blockade, that flagrant violation of international law, which was destroying the civilization. What happened next has been reported in many places. Namely, Israel patiently waited until November 4th, 2008. Does anyone here remember, let's see how smart you are. Does anyone here remember what was November 4th, 2008? You can whisper to each other and come to a collective answer in communist tradition. Anyone want to try? Okay, that's all right. November 4th was the U.S. election day. And, of course, all of the American media and the American people were watching closely the result of the election. And Israel waited for that day. And on that day, well, let me quote to you from Amnesty International what Israel did. Amnesty said, there was a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And the ceasefire was working for 4.5 months. But the ceasefire broke down after Israeli army forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on November 4th. Israel waited until Americans were not looking, and then it broke the ceasefire because it wanted a war. It had been preparing for at least a year for that attack on Gaza, because Gaza had nothing to do with the Gazans. That's the most important point to remember. It had to do with the defeat in Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Every time you hear somebody say, Israel attacked Gaza because of the missile attacks on Israel, but there was a ceasefire, and the ceasefire was working. Israel said Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. It had nothing to do with rocket and mortar attacks from Israel. Israel was looking for an excuse, a pretext, to launch the attack on Gaza so that it could restore its deterrent capacity in the Arab world. Well, the ceasefire broke down. Hamas began its rocket and mortar attacks. But Hamas kept saying over and over again, we're ready to restore the ceasefire. just Israel has to lift the blockade of Gaza, which is what it had promised to do. We're ready to restore the ceasefire. Israel said no. Israel said, you have to stop the rocket and mortar attacks, but we are not going to lift the blockade of Gaza. And now the Palestinians basically had only two options, only two choices. One was to just sit still and accept that they were going to be gradually strangled by this blockade. And the second choice was to fight. Now, the Palestinians chose to fight, although we have to be honest and say the fighting was really only symbolic. It wasn't real fighting. Well, after the attack on Gaza, it lasted 22 days. It began on December 27th and it ended on January 18th. After the attack on Gaza, the Israelis were very proud and very happy. They said, now we have restored our deterrence capacity. The Arabs now know who is in charge in the Arab world, who is the boss. Why? Because the Israelis said, we won the war in Gaza. We won the war in Gaza. And then an Israeli military analyst, he came along and he said, it's very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war in Gaza when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days. Well, if there was no war in Gaza, what happened during those 22 days? On a military level, it's pretty clear. Israel began the attack on Gaza with what it called the air stage of the war. By the end of the 22 days, Israel had flown about 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. Every plane returned. No plane was downed. In fact, not a single plane was damaged, which is not too surprising because the Palestinians had no anti-aircraft defenses. Then, after the first week, Israel began its land invasion of Gaza. But the Israeli soldiers had special night fighting equipment. Hamas couldn't even see them, let alone fight them. Well, if there was no fighting in Gaza, no battles in Gaza, well, what did happen during those 22 days? And actually, we have a very good source of information about what happened during those 22 days, because many Israeli soldiers, after those 22 days, they stepped forward and they said, this is what I saw in Gaza. This is what I witnessed in Gaza. This is what I experienced in Gaza. So what did they see? What did they experience? Here's what the soldiers had to say. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns. Except for some sheep and goats, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier. I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there. That whole week. Soldier. Everyone was disappointed because there were no fights. Soldier. Usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course. Not a soul. Soldier. Go ahead. Ask the other soldiers how often they saw combatants in Gaza. Nothing. No one. Soldier. There was supposed to be a tiny resistance when we entered Gaza, but there just wasn't any. Now I noticed as I was repeating their observations that several of you laughed. And it would be funny if that were the whole story. But there's a second half. And the second half is, if you read through the testimonies of the same soldiers, they begin by saying, there was no fighting, there were no battles, there was no enemy. But then over and over and over again, the soldiers kept saying the same thing. They said, there was no battle, there was no enemy, there was no fighting, but Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Insane is not my word. Insane is their word. If you go to the website of the soldier testimonies, it's called Breaking the Silence. You go to their website, and then under the search function, you just enter the word insane. You'll see it keeps coming up again and again and again. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. One soldier said, "This was firepower such as I had never known. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking." Another soldier said, "On the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that used to rock the houses in which we were stationed." The Israelis took over Palestinian homes. They're firing into the distance, but the insane amounts of firepower are making the ground underneath them shake. And their commanders are telling them, get out of the houses because the houses are going to collapse on you. Even though they're firing into the distance, they're insane amounts of firepower. So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, the soldiers themselves, they gave the most revealing picture of what happened. One soldier said, it felt like hunting season had begun. How do you translate that?
Parecia que era a época da caça.
Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game. Another soldier said, you felt like a child with a magnifying glass burning ants.